So, thank you very much. I would first like to thank the organizers for putting together this wonderful program and for letting me talk about what has recently become one of my favorite subjects. I say recently because most of my career I worked in other systems than forests. Lately on aquatic systems with mathematical model and more general theory development. So that's why I'm probably a new face to many of you. I will talk about this study, Climate Mitigation Forestry Temporal Trade-offs, that we published 5 months ago. It's work that I made in close collaboration with Torbjörn Schütt and Bengt-Gunnar Jonsson. Torbjörn Schütt is the first author of the paper. And in this paper, and they work at the Mid-University in Sweden, I should say. In this paper, we basically ask the question, how is climate affected by clear cutting in short and long term? And an important background to this study is this. Let's see how that works. This is a set of quotes from major players in the public and scientific debate in Sweden. And they all say the same thing. Logging is good for the climate. And I think it's fair to say that this has become a sort of paradigmatic truth in the Swedish debate. And the idea is held by all major actors, including governmental institutions, the forest industry, a group of prominent applied forest researchers at Agricultural University, especially in Umeå, and nearly all political parties. So it's a very strong paradigm today. And I can tell already now that we come to a different conclusion. So a very interesting question that I also will touch upon is why we come to different conclusions. I will start by describing two different approaches to the problem that gives one answer to the question. Many of those that claim that logging provide climate benefits refer to what we could call a steady state model that I illustrate here. Let's say that we have a forest with 9 hectares and we harvest 1 hectare every 9 years. And after 81 years, the forest will look like this. And we can harvest the first hectare again. And if we continue doing that, we will have a system with stable age structure, constant harvest that's equal to the growth, and the system is almost climate neutral. If we also add substitution effects, or if we do not harvest 100% of the growth, the system will be climate positive, so to say. So that's fine, but this model doesn't really answer the question that we want to know now. And that is, what is the effect of harvesting or other management strategies? And to answer that type of questions, we doesn't only need sort of a budget for a single stand or a landscape, but we need to make a comparison. We need a comparative approach, which is illustrated here. Let's say what we want to know the effect of harvesting. Then we can compare two scenarios, one where we harvest and one where we don't harvest. So let's say that we harvest this hectare and we let this hectare stay and the trees continue to grow. And the effect between of harvesting will then be the difference between the two scenarios. And if we look closer on that, we see that the effect varies over time. Initially, the unharvested scenario has much higher carbon sequestration because there we have big trees that sucks up a lot of carbon. And the other alternative, we have bare ground and also some decomposition from forest residues. The difference will decrease over time when the logged area regrow, and in the very long run, we will actually get higher sequestration on the logged in the logged scenario. So this is sort of a simplistic representation to basically describe two approaches to the problem. And we have, of course, used the comparative approach here. And this is how we did it. We defined as our reference scenario for comparison 2 days harvest levels, which is yearly harvest of 80% of the yearly growth, sometimes called the business as usual scenario. And we compare that with alternative harvest scenarios. 0%, no harvest, 40%, 60% of growth, or harvesting 90% of the growth. We then simulated the dynamics of the different carbon pools that are important here. The most important one is the forest, of course. So we kept track of changes in living and dead trees and in the soil. And here we use the Eureka system, which is a wonderful simulation tool developed by Agricultural University in Umeå. It can be used to study many different aspects of forestry. And today, I would say it's considered the gold standard for studying the carbon balance in forests. We also kept track of the carbon pool stored in wood products and houses and things like that, with a simple input-output model where output is an exponential decline model with a half-life of 35 years, which is what is recommended by IPCC. We also kept track of avoided emissions through substitution. The idea here is that we can avoid emissions from fossil fuels and materials by replacing them with biomass-based alternatives. This is an idea that is much discussed, and many researchers think that we have greatly overestimated the value of substitution. But we decided here to follow the dominating paradigm, so to say. And that is actually our main strategy here, not to come up with so much own excellent ideas, but follow the paradigm, because we understood early on that we will find results that goes against the prevailing paradigm, and so would receive a lot of criticism. So trying to meet that criticism already in the design was important. We did these calculations for 5 different counties in Sweden, along a gradient from north to south. That is also a strong productivity gradient. And this is the type of result that we got. Here is results for Norrbotten, the northernmost county, which also has the lowest productivity. And this is result for a no harvest scenario. And on the y-axis, we have what we call the climate benefit. It's a bit complex, but it's the effect of an activity on the net transport to or from the atmosphere. For simplicity, you can think of positive value as a climate benefit. And I should also say that the benefit is calculated as a difference between the reference, today's forestry, and our alternative. So we see positive values here for the no harvest scenario, which means that no harvest provide more climate benefit than today's forestry. The curve levels off at around 2100, but still after 150 years, no harvest is better than today's forestry. Here are the other harvesting alternatives. 60 and 40% alternatives show up sort of intermediate, which is expected. And you can note that the 95% alternative with increasing harvesting is negative for the climate here. So this is for Norrbotten, a very unproductive area. If we look at Scania, the southern tip of Sweden, we see quite a different pattern, which is interesting, I think. The initial benefit of reducing harvest is larger, but it peaks earlier at around 50 years. And you can see that the no harvest scenario, the green curve actually crosses the x-axis at around 2150. And after that, it gets worse than 2 days forestry. The other alternatives also levels off and decrease, but it's slower. So if we decrease the harvest intensity a little, we get a lower initial benefit, but it lasts longer. And similarly, you can see that when we harvest in non-productive areas, we get smaller climate benefits, but they last longer. The temporal patterns that you see here is entirely driven by, or almost entirely driven by, what happens with in the forest, with the forest growth especially. So we can look at this graph that shows the total carbon sequestration in a forest if we stop harvesting today. And you can see these are for the 5 different counties. And you can see that the sequestration increases the first 25, 30 years and then levels off. And finally, for the southernmost counties, it actually becomes negative. And this pattern is why we see this initial climate benefit. And this is also why low harvest scenarios gets a problem, so to say, in the very long run. Now I really want to stress that this is according to the Heureka model. And those that know something about Heureka all seem to agree that we can't really trust the growth models for old forests. There wasn't simply data enough to make good models for old forests when the models were estimated in the 90s. So one important lesson from this part is that the short-term predictions are relatively safe, but the long-term predictions are extremely uncertain. What we assume about substitution also has an effect, not so much on the temporal pattern, but on the level of climate benefit that we see. Here we have made a simple sensitivity analysis where we have either decreased the value of substitution by 50% or doubled it. And we did this for Gävleborg, which is a county in the central Sweden. And I think you can note on the left graph here that the initial benefit of harvesting is not so impressive any longer, but it's still there, and it lasts at least up to 2100. Finally, to provide some context, we compared the short-term benefits of reducing harvest with the stated annual emissions according to the climate mitigation plans for the different counties. And we did this for the period from 2020 to 2045. So the gray bars here are the expected emissions for the different counties from all other sources. And the green bars are the climate benefits that we get if we choose a no harvest scenario. And you can see that the you can think of the no harvest scenario as a description of the potential, the maximum potential that we can get out from the forest sector. And you can see that it's huge. I mean, for Gävleborg and Jämtland is actually 16 times bigger than emissions from all other sources. For Scania, where we have a lot of people and little forest, the two bars are approximately equal. Now, no harvest scenarios are not very or interesting, but not very realistic. And I did calculate the same thing for a 40 and 60% scenario for Gävleborg. And you can see that even a moderate decrease of the harvest level provide an enormous climate benefit, several times bigger than the and all other emissions for this county. And obviously it would look a little bit different from Scania. These effects are approximately linear, so you can imagine what will happen there. So now I would like to say something about why we come to different conclusions than everybody else or many other researchers. This is a tricky question because it sort of requires some mind reading. But so I can only make some observations based on others' results and what is written in their papers. But the first thing we can note is that the results that we present here, that we get short-term benefits from reducing harvest levels is found in most studies. Here is a set of 3 studies. I won't go into any details, but these are published by researchers that typically favor intensive forest, and I think that's intensive forest is good for the climate. But even those researchers find that if you see the green arrow there, showing that you get an initial climate benefit that lasts up to 2090 in that study. Thomas Lundmark in one study find that the benefit of no harvest lasts up to 2160, and in a newer one from the same author, 70 years in the future, which would be 2090 also. So how could this author come to conclusions that are different from ours? And many other authors also do that, of course. Well, one observation that you can make is that one thing that is done is that another scenario is thrown into the soup, so to say. Typically a scenario with increased growth, sort of an optimistic future forest scenario. And the study of Gustafsson is an excellent example there. The orange curve here is the production scenario, which implies that fertilization is increased by 100%, and pine is replaced with Pinus contorta on 50% of the land. So pretty dramatic effects. But that, of course, generates an enormous growth in the forest. Growth is the most important here. So you can see that the orange curve, even though this graph is upside down compared to what we see before, the orange curve shows that it's better from the climate benefit perspective to have this intensive production scenario. So here we sort of ask slightly different questions. What is it that we compare with? Another argument is that the short-term effects are negligible when compared to the long-term effects. And of course, our study shows that no, they are not. But I want to show you again the result from our sensitivity analysis, where we doubled the substitution. And now you can see on the green curve that the short-term climate benefit from a no harvest scenario is no longer that impressive compared to the sort of the negative climatic effects in the long term. So you can see that if you make very optimistic assumptions about substitution, you could end up with a different conclusion and support this argument. So, summary of my results. The climate benefit of reduced harvest is large during the next 50 to 100 years, but today's harvest level can be better in a very long time perspective. But it's important to remember that the long-term predictions are highly, not to say extremely uncertain. No one really trusts them, whereas short-term predictions are comparably certain, at least comparably. And one sort of new result that we present here is that the short-term benefits is larger on high productive land, but not as long-lasting as it is on low productive land. So we can sort of choose if we want to have high short-term effects or more long-lasting effects, climate benefits. And finally, the effect of reduced harvest is several times larger than the emissions from other anthropogenic sources. And the summary of my second question would be that, well, sometimes we make different comparisons, but we use the results to answer the same question about the climate benefit of forestry. So that's an obvious reason why we can come to different conclusions. And we also make different assumptions about substitution. I've spared you the details about substitution in these talks because there's a lot to talk about that. But we have been thinking very hard and for a very long time about how to treat substitution and sort of analyzing the substitution logic. And I can say that we are very critical to the way substitution is used in many studies. It's used very superficially, and not a lot of thought is put into the subject. And I foresee that substitution will be the next and most important frontier in the near future when it comes to the scientific debate about this issue, how forestry affects the climate. With that, I would like to thank you, and I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. It's quite a few questions, and I will select a few of them. First of all, the time perspective, isn't that very central in relation to the UN environmental targets of 1.5%? Because, I mean, what happens when it comes to forest and forestry 150 years from now will not be critical to the decisions made now in the coming 15, 20, 30 years when we really need to reduce the emissions. What's your comment on that?
Well, you're absolutely right there. I mean, it's if you favor a sort of high harvesting scenario, it means that you will accept increased emissions during the coming decades when we actually are supposed to make dramatic declines in the amount of carbon that reaches the atmosphere. I think it's just untenable to have such a standpoint today. Maybe it was accepted, I mean, 2015 before the 1.5 degree report came from IPCC, but now I actually think it's untenable.
Yeah, and then thank you. There's another question when it comes to this model system that you use. Isn't it so that this model that you use have a factor that says that forests around 100 years cease to be carbon sinks, but there are quite a few studies around showing that old growth forest continues to be carbon sinks for a long time, and also that forest stands which is 100 years or more around that age, they continue to grow. The carbon stock continue to grow for a very long time. So isn't the model quite weak in that sense?
It is. I mean, there are good reasons to distrust the long-term predictions, and also the long-term sort of benefits of intensive forestry strategies. But I still think it's a bit early to. I mean, we can definitely say that we can't trust those predictions. But will the future tell us that old forests continue to sequester carbon as much as middle-aged forests? Well, some data actually suggests that that is the case, but I think it's too early to have a sort of certain opinion about that. Seems likely,
Okay,
but
thank you.
it's a bit too early yet.
Yeah. Let's see. Then it's a couple of persons who want you to comment the report published by the Swedish Forestry Agency. Högberg is one of the writers, which concluded that intensive forest management in the north increases the climate benefits. This is I don't know if all the attendees have seen this, but this is a quite debated report published recently. Can you comment the quality and your views on this report?
Yeah, there are two problems with that report. One is that I mean, they compare different areas where forestry has been going on for quite a long time. So the different harvest levels that has been sort of in place for some time. So you could probably say that any result that you would find there would indicate the long-term effects of forestry, which would be interesting, of course, but it doesn't really answer the pressing question that we have now. What should we do with the forest the next decades? So it's irrelevant for that question about short-term benefits or not benefits. And the other thing is that as a sort of design, it doesn't really meet scientific standards. I mean, if you compare regions with different climate, different species composition, different ways of collecting data, and different management strategies, how could you know that the difference that you would find actually are there because you have different harvest levels? I mean, you need a much more deeper and detailed analysis to sort of tease apart all possible different drivers. And with 5 regions, you just don't have the statistical power to do that. I would say it presents interesting data on the development of the forest inventory in those regions, but as an effect study, it doesn't meet scientific standards.
Thank you. And then it's a question about substitution. So this is the question. Did you consider a model where the substitution declines over time? We can expect that there will be less fossil fuels in the future to substitute.
No, we decided not to do that. For sort of simplicity, I first say that it seems likely that the value of substitution will decrease. But we decided not to do that, but instead use 2 days substitution and then just do the simple sensitivity analysis I mean, you may think of the 50% alternative that I showed as an example of what it will look like sometime in the future.
Yeah. So actually, you took the data and the ways to predict different things, which is commonly used by the scientists who have a opposite scenario in front of them, so that you can compare these two things. Basically, you didn't come with, I mean, you used the same variables which is commonly used, so that you will not get beaten on the hand for coming with new things. Is that what you're saying, basically?
Yes, there is one important exception there that I didn't mention, but we actually had a very sort of restrictive view of substitution, in the sense that for each type of product, we asked ourselves what will happen if you deliver less biomass to the industry. Will then more fossil fuels or materials be used? And if the answer is no, we assume that there will be no substitution. One excellent example is graphic paper. We don't have any fossil alternative to books or any sort of paper that we print on. So there can be no substitution there.
Yeah, it's take one last question here. The question is, in addition to the substitution effect, was the effect on long-term carbon storage in products considered?
Yes, we did keep track of the the pool of carbon stored in houses and in furniture, etc. And what surprised me a little bit is that that's not a very critical thing here. I mean, it makes quite a small contribution to the overall picture. So the temporal pattern is entirely set by what happens in the forest. And what you assume about substitution sort of regulates the level of the curves that describes the temporal pattern. And the contribution from increased or decreased storage of carbon in products is a minor factor here.